I stopped a man from jumping off a bridge, and now his family is suing me for the injuries he got when I grabbed him. The process server found me in the parking lot of my gym on a Friday evening, handing me the lawsuit while I was loading my duffel bag into my trunk. "Nathan Reeves?" he asked, and when I nodded, he pushed the envelope into my hands. "You've been served." I stood there in the cold November air, reading the first page of a complaint that accused me of assault, battery, false imprisonment, and negligence causing severe bodily harm. The plaintiff was demanding $2 million in damages for injuries sustained when I'd physically restrained him on the Morrison Bridge 3 weeks earlier. The injuries listed included a dislocated shoulder, fractured collarbone, severe bruising, and ongoing psychological trauma. I read it twice before the reality settled in. The man I'd stopped from jumping to his death was suing me for saving his life. His name was Owen Castellano, and I'd first seen him standing on the wrong side of the bridge railing on a gray October afternoon. I'd been driving home from my contracting job, stuck in bridge traffic, when I noticed him through my windshield. He was maybe 30 feet ahead, his body silhouetted against the slate-colored sky, hands gripping the railing behind him while his feet balanced on the narrow ledge over the Willamette River. Cars were slowing, creating the traffic jam I was caught in, but no one was getting out. Everyone was just watching, waiting for someone else to do something. I'd pulled onto the shoulder, put on my hazards, and started running toward him before I'd fully processed what I was doing. Owen was wearing a business suit, his tie whipping in the wind, and he was crying. I could see that clearly as I approached, the way his shoulders shook with sobs even as he stared down at the water 200 feet below. I'd stopped about 10 feet away, my heart hammering, and said his name even though I didn't know it yet. "Hey man, don't do this. Whatever's happening, we can figure it out." Owen had turned his head to look at me, his face wet with tears and snot, his eyes red and exhausted. "You don't know anything about my life. You don't know what I've lost." His voice was raw, broken in a way that made my chest ache. I'd taken a step closer, hands raised to show I wasn't a threat. "You're right. I don't know. But I know that jumping doesn't fix anything. It just ends everything. And there are people who love you who'll have to live with this forever." Owen had laughed bitterly. "The people who loved me are gone. There's nothing left." He'd loosened his grip on the railing, shifting his weight forward, and that's when I'd lunged for him. I'd grabbed him around the torso, wrapping both arms around his chest and yanking him backward with all my strength. Owen had fought me immediately, thrashing and screaming for me to let go, his elbow connecting with my jaw hard enough to make my vision blur. We'd struggled against the railing, his body half over the edge while I'd pulled with everything I had. His shoulder had made a sickening pop as I'd wrenched him backward, and he'd screamed in pain, but I hadn't let go. We'd fallen together onto the bridge walkway, Owen underneath me, still fighting, still begging me to let him die. Other people had finally approached, helping me hold him down while someone called 911. The police and paramedics had arrived within minutes, taking Owen into custody for a psychiatric hold. He'd been sobbing and incoherent, clutching his injured shoulder while medics stabilized him. One of the officers had taken my statement and thanked me for intervening. A paramedic had checked the bruise forming on my jaw and told me I'd done the right thing. 3 weeks later, I was holding a lawsuit that painted me as the villain. The complaint described me as a vigilante who'd assaulted Owen without permission, causing permanent physical injuries that would require ongoing medical treatment and physical therapy. It claimed I'd violated his bodily autonomy and civil rights by physically restraining him against his will. The legal language was cold and clinical, stripping away all context about why I'd grabbed him, focusing only on the act of grabbing itself and the injuries that resulted. There was no mention of the bridge, the suicidal intent, the 200-foot drop to the river below, just dry descriptions of shoulder dislocation, bone fracture, soft tissue damage, and emotional distress. I felt sick reading it, my hands shaking as I flipped through the pages of exhibits showing medical bills and injury photographs. I called my wife immediately. Tessa answered on the first ring, her voice warm and distracted because she was making dinner while our 2 kids argued over Lego bricks in the background. "Nate, you on your way home?" I told her about the lawsuit, my voice tight and controlled, and heard her go silent on the other end. When she finally spoke, her tone had shifted to something sharp and focused. "That's insane. You saved his life. How is this even legal?" I told her I didn't know, but that we needed a lawyer immediately. Tessa said she'd start researching attorneys as soon as we got the kids to bed, and that we'd figure this out together. Her certainty helped, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that saving Owen Castellano had been the biggest mistake of my life. That evening, after our kids were asleep, Tessa and I sat at the kitchen table reading through the lawsuit in detail. The more we read, the worse it got. The complaint painted a detailed picture of Owen as a mentally ill man experiencing a crisis who'd been violently assaulted by a stranger. It claimed my intervention had been unnecessary because police and crisis negotiators were already en route and would have talked Owen down safely without physical force. It argued that my decision to grab him had been reckless and had directly caused his injuries, which could have been avoided if I'd simply called 911 and waited for professionals. The lawsuit included statements from Owen's psychiatrist describing the psychological trauma of being physically restrained during a mental health crisis, and how that trauma had worsened his underlying depression and PTSD. Reading those clinical descriptions of my actions as trauma rather than rescue made me feel genuinely sick. The next morning, I called 3 different attorneys before finding one willing to take the case. Most lawyers I spoke with seemed baffled by the situation and suggested I contact civil rights attorneys who specialized in Good Samaritan cases. The attorney who finally agreed to represent me was a woman named Diane Kowalski, who'd spent 20 years defending people accused of wrongdoing while trying to help others. Her practice had expanded to include cases exactly like mine, where rescuers faced legal retaliation from the people they'd saved. Over the phone, she'd told me these cases were becoming more common as people discovered they could weaponize personal injury law against anyone who touched them, regardless of intent or outcome. She'd asked me to come to her office that afternoon with the lawsuit and any documentation I had about the incident. Diane's office was downtown in an older building with creaky floors and walls lined with legal books. She was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun and sharp eyes that assessed me carefully as I explained what happened on the bridge. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and shook her head. Oregon has Good Samaritan laws that should protect you, but they're narrower than most people realize. They cover emergency medical care, but physical restraint of someone in psychiatric crisis exists in a gray area legally. The plaintiff's attorney is going to argue you weren't providing medical care, you were committing assault. She pulled up the relevant statute on her computer and showed me. The protection applied to people rendering emergency assistance in good faith, but the law had exceptions and limitations that skilled attorneys could exploit. Diane explained that we'd need to establish several things to win the case. First, that Owen had been in immediate danger of death or serious injury, which justified my physical intervention. Second, that my actions were reasonable under the circumstances and consistent with what any reasonable person would have done. Third, that I'd acted in good faith without malicious intent. And fourth, that the injuries Owen sustained were an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of preventing his suicide, not the result of excessive force or negligence on my part. She said we'd need witness statements from other people on the bridge, police reports from the incident, and expert testimony about suicide intervention protocols. The evidence gathering would take time and money. Her retainer was $18,000, and the case could easily cost twice that by the time we reached trial if it wasn't dismissed first. I'd felt my stomach drop at the numbers, but Tessa had grabbed my hand and said we'd find the money somewhere. We couldn't let this stand. Diane had nodded approvingly. Good, because the plaintiff's attorney, Lawrence Vega, is one of the most aggressive personal injury lawyers in the state. He takes cases on contingency, which means he only gets paid if he wins or settles. He's betting you'll settle rather than go through the expense and public exposure of a trial. We need to show him we're willing to fight. She'd started a legal pad with notes about discovery requests and witness interviews. I'd left her office feeling slightly better, but still deeply shaken by how easily my life was being upended by a lawsuit that felt fundamentally unjust. The lawsuit became public knowledge within days because court filings were public record and local media loved controversial cases. A journalist from the city newspaper called me 3 days after I'd been served, asking for comment about the Good Samaritan lawsuit that was generating attention online. I declined to comment on advice from Diane, but the article ran anyway, framing the case as a legal gray area that raised questions about liability when helping people in crisis. The comments section had been vicious, split almost evenly between people defending me as a hero and others arguing that I'd overstepped by physically grabbing someone without consent. Several commenters suggested I'd been motivated by a savior complex rather than genuine concern, and that people in mental health crisis deserved autonomy over their own bodies even if that meant choosing death. My employer, a commercial construction firm where I'd worked as a project manager for 8 years, called me into the owner's office the following week. Dennis Huang sat behind his desk looking uncomfortable, explaining that several clients had seen the news coverage and expressed concerns about having me manage their projects. He'd emphasized that he personally believed I'd done the right thing, but that the company had to consider its reputation and client relationships. I was being placed on unpaid leave pending resolution of the lawsuit. The decision was framed as temporary and protective, but it felt like punishment. I'd cleaned out my desk that afternoon while coworkers avoided eye contact, everyone aware of what was happening, but no one knowing what to say. By the end of the week, I was unemployed in everything but technical status, my reputation in ruins because I'd stopped a stranger from killing himself. Diane filed our response to the lawsuit 2 weeks later, denying all allegations and asserting Good Samaritan immunity as an affirmative defense. Her brief argued that I'd acted reasonably to prevent imminent death, that Owen's injuries were the unfortunate but unavoidable result of necessary force to pull him from the bridge railing, and that any reasonable person in my position would have acted similarly. She'd attached witness statements from 3 other drivers who'd been on the bridge that day, all confirming that Owen had been standing on the ledge preparing to jump, and that I'd acted to save his life. She'd also included the police report from the incident, which documented Owen's suicidal intent and psychiatric hold. The response was thorough and compelling, but Lawrence Vega filed an opposition arguing that Good Samaritan immunity didn't apply because I'd used excessive force and caused injuries that exceeded what was necessary for rescue. Discovery began immediately after the initial pleadings. Vega demanded my complete employment records, financial statements, any previous lawsuits or criminal history, and all communications I'd ever had about mental health or suicide. He wanted to depose me, my wife, the police officers who'd responded to the bridge, and anyone else who'd witnessed the incident. Diane fought the most invasive requests, but some were granted by the judge. My deposition was scheduled for 6 weeks out, and Diane warned me that Vega would try to make me look reckless, overly aggressive, or motivated by something other than genuine concern. She'd prepared me extensively, running through potential questions and teaching me how to answer without providing ammunition for the plaintiff's case. Stay calm. Answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information, and don't let Vega provoke you into anger or defensiveness. The deposition took place in Vega's downtown office, a sleek modern space with glass walls and expensive furniture. Vega was a man in his early 40s with perfectly styled hair and an aggressive courtroom demeanor that started the moment we sat down. "Mr. Reeves, how often do you drive across the Morrison Bridge?" I'd told him I crossed it daily for work. Vega had made a note. "So you're familiar with the pedestrian walkways and the barriers designed to prevent falls?" I'd confirmed I was generally aware of them. He'd leaned forward. "Were you aware that the bridge has emergency phones positioned every 100 feet, specifically for people in crisis to call for help?" I'd said I'd seen them, but hadn't thought about them in that moment. Vega had smiled slightly. "So instead of directing Mr. Castellano to use an emergency phone to reach trained crisis counselors, you decided to physically assault him?" Diane had objected immediately to the characterization, but Vega had continued pressing. "Mr. Reeves, do you have any training in crisis intervention? Any mental health background? Any medical training beyond basic first aid?" I'd admitted I had none of those qualifications. Vega had looked satisfied. "So you had no professional basis for deciding that physical force was appropriate in this situation?" I'd explained that Owen was about to jump, that there was no time to call for help, that I'd acted on instinct to prevent immediate death. Vega had challenged every statement. "How do you know he was about to jump? Did he tell you that? Or did you assume based on his position?" I'd said his position and his statements made his intent clear. Vega had asked what statements specifically. I'd described Owen saying there was nothing left for him, that the people who loved him were gone. Vega had pounced. "So he was expressing grief and despair, and your response was to violently grab him?" The deposition had continued for 4 hours, with Vega systematically reframing every detail of the rescue as assault. He'd focused extensively on the moment I'd grabbed Owen, asking about exactly where I'd placed my hands, how much force I'd used, whether I'd considered less aggressive alternatives. When I'd described Owen fighting me and the struggle that resulted, Vega had suggested that Owen's resistance proved he hadn't wanted my help, and that I'd forced my intervention against his will. He'd asked about the popping sound Owen's shoulder had made, and whether I'd stopped when Owen screamed in pain. I'd explained that stopping would have meant letting him fall to his death, but Vega had twisted that into admission that I'd prioritized my own judgment over Owen's expressed wishes regarding his own body. By the end, I'd felt exhausted and demoralized, watching as every good intention was recast as violence. Diane had tried to repair the damage during her questioning, walking me through the timeline again and establishing that I'd had seconds to make a decision, that Owen's life was in immediate danger, and that the injuries he'd sustained were far preferable to death by falling 200 feet into a river. But I could tell from Vega's expression that he felt confident in how the deposition had gone. As we'd left his office, he'd made a point of mentioning settlement. "Your client should think seriously about resolving this before it gets more expensive. My client isn't going away and juries are unpredictable. A reasonable settlement saves everyone time and money." Diane had told him we weren't interested in settlement, and that we'd see him in court. Over the following weeks, Diane's investigation uncovered critical information about Owen Castellano's background and his family's motivations. Her private investigator had found that Owen's wife had died by suicide 18 months earlier, jumping from a parking garage downtown. Owen had been the one to find her body, and he'd blamed himself for not recognizing the warning signs of her depression. He'd developed severe PTSD and depression following her death, had been hospitalized twice for suicidal ideation, and had lost his job as an insurance adjuster because he could no longer function. The day I'd stopped him on the bridge had been the anniversary of his wife's death. He'd gone there specifically to jump from the same height she had, completing what he saw as his failure to save her by joining her in death. The psychological complexity of Owen's situation made my intervention even more clearly justified, but it also explained why his family might feel desperate about his medical bills and ongoing care costs. The investigator had also discovered that Owen's lawsuit was being driven primarily by his sister, Margaret Castellano, who'd been appointed his legal guardian after his psychiatric hospitalization following the bridge incident. Margaret was a real estate agent who'd recently filed for bankruptcy due to failed property investments. She'd been researching personal injury attorneys within days of Owen's hospitalization, and phone records showed multiple calls between her and Lawrence Vega's office before Owen had even been discharged from psychiatric care. The financial motive was obvious. Margaret needed money, Owen had a plausible injury claim, and Vega worked on contingency betting on a settlement from my homeowner's insurance. Diane had included all of this in a supplemental brief, arguing that the lawsuit was financially motivated rather than about genuine harm, and that Margaret had exploited her brother's mental illness to generate a legal claim. Vega had filed an angry response calling our investigation harassment and claiming that Margaret's financial situation was irrelevant to whether I'd caused Owen's injuries. But Diane had argued it went directly to motive and credibility. If Margaret was using Owen's mental illness as an opportunity to generate money through litigation, that fundamentally undermined the claim that this lawsuit was about protecting Owen's rights or obtaining justice for wrongs done to him. The judge had agreed to allow evidence about Margaret's financial condition and her timeline of contacting attorneys, ruling that it was relevant to assessing the legitimacy of the claims. That small victory had felt significant, but we were still months away from trial and drowning in legal fees. Tessa and I had already spent $26,000 on defense costs, draining our savings and forcing us to take out a home equity loan. The emotional toll was worse than the financial burden. I'd stopped sleeping properly, lying awake, replaying the moment on the bridge, and wondering if I should have just let Owen jump. The thought was horrifying, but the alternative had been this nightmare of legal destruction and character assassination. My kids had started asking why I was home all day, why I seemed sad and distracted, why people at their school were talking about Daddy being in trouble. Tessa had done her best to shield them, but it was impossible to completely hide the stress fracturing our family. She'd found me crying in our garage one evening, sitting on the concrete floor with my head in my hands, and she'd sat down beside me without saying anything. Eventually, I'd told her I regretted saving Owen, that I wished I'd just driven past and let someone else deal with it. Tessa had grabbed my face and forced me to look at her. Don't say that. Don't let them make you regret being a good person. You saved a life. That matters, even if he and his family are too broken to see it. Owen's deposition was scheduled 3 months after mine, and Diane had prepared extensively for it. She'd wanted to establish Owen's suicidal intent, his history of mental illness, and his acknowledgement that he would have died without intervention. But when we arrived at the deposition, Owen looked fundamentally different from the man I'd grabbed on the bridge. He was thin and pale, moving carefully because his shoulder still caused pain, and his eyes had a medicated flatness that suggested heavy psychiatric drugs. He answered Diane's questions in a monotone, confirming that he'd gone to the bridge intending to kill himself, that he'd climbed over the railing, that he'd been preparing to jump. But when Diane asked if he understood I'd been trying to save his life, Owen's expression had flickered with something that might have been anger or confusion. He didn't save me. He just delayed things. He had no right to touch me, my body, my choice about what happens to it. Diane had pressed gently. But you would have died if Nathan hadn't pulled you back. You understand that? Owen had shrugged with his good shoulder. Maybe that would have been better. I wanted to die. He took that away from me, and he hurt me doing it. My shoulder will never be the same. His voice carried no emotion, just flat statement of facts as he perceived them. Diane had asked about his wife's death and his PTSD, trying to establish context for his suicidal state, but Owen had shut down, saying he didn't want to discuss his wife. Vega had objected repeatedly, claiming Diane was trying to humiliate Owen by forcing him to relive trauma. The deposition had ended with nothing useful for our defense, just Owen's mechanical insistence that I'd assaulted him and that his injuries were my fault. Watching him, I'd felt a complicated mix of anger and pity. He was clearly still suffering, still mentally ill, and being manipulated by people who saw him as a source of money rather than a person who needed help. Margaret Castellano's deposition had been more revealing. She'd sat across from Diane with defensive hostility, insisting that she was protecting her brother's interests and ensuring he received compensation for the harm done to him. When Diane had asked about her bankruptcy filing and her financial problems, Margaret had become angry. My finances have nothing to do with Owen's injuries. This lawsuit is about holding someone accountable for hurting my brother. But Diane had produced phone records showing Margaret had called 5 different personal injury attorneys in the 3 days after Owen's hospitalization, long before he was mentally stable enough to understand legal options or make decisions about litigation. Margaret had claimed she'd been researching options, doing due diligence as Owen's guardian. Diane had asked why she'd contacted only attorneys who worked on contingency for maximum potential payouts, rather than attorneys who might have helped Owen access mental health resources or disability benefits. Margaret hadn't had a good answer. The most damaging moment of Margaret's deposition had come when Diane asked directly whether she'd encouraged Owen to file the lawsuit, despite his psychiatrist's concerns that litigation would worsen his mental health. Margaret had hesitated too long before answering, and when she'd finally said she'd only wanted what was best for Owen, her voice had lacked conviction. Diane had produced an email from Owen's psychiatrist to Margaret, obtained through a subpoena, stating explicitly that pursuing litigation would likely increase Owen's trauma symptoms and fixation on the bridge incident, and recommending against legal action. Margaret had dismissed the email, saying she'd sought second opinions from other doctors who'd felt differently, but Diane had asked her to name those doctors, and Margaret had been unable to provide names or contact information. The deposition had made clear that Margaret had pushed forward with the lawsuit against medical advice because she needed money and saw Owen's injuries as a potential source of income. 6 months after being served, we finally reached the motion hearing where Diane would argue for dismissal based on Good Samaritan immunity. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Judge Patricia Finch presided, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for impatience with frivolous litigation. Diane had told me this was a good draw, that Finch had dismissed several bogus personal injury cases and didn't tolerate attorneys who abused the legal system. We sat at the defense table while Owen and Margaret sat with Vega across the aisle. Owen looked even thinner than at his deposition, and he kept his eyes down, not acknowledging my presence. Margaret stared at me with open hostility, her expression suggesting she genuinely believed I was some kind of villain who'd hurt her brother for no reason. Diane presented our argument first, walking Judge Finch through the timeline of events, the witness statements confirming Owen's suicidal intent, the police report documenting psychiatric emergency, and the clear legal protection provided by Good Samaritan laws for people acting in good faith to prevent imminent death. Your Honor, Nathan Reeves acted heroically to save a life. Owen Castellano was seconds away from jumping to certain death when Mr. Reeves intervened. The injuries Mr. Castellano sustained were unfortunate, but unavoidable consequences of necessary force to prevent suicide. Penalizing people for saving lives sends a terrible message that bystanders should simply watch others die rather than risk legal liability for helping. She'd emphasized the witness testimony, the lack of any evidence of excessive force beyond what was required to pull Owen from the railing, and the financial motivation behind Margaret's decision to file suit despite psychiatric recommendations against litigation. Vega had countered by arguing that Good Samaritan immunity had limits, and that I'd exceeded them by using physical force that caused permanent injury to someone who was mentally ill and unable to provide consent for my intervention. Your Honor, this case isn't about whether Owen Castellano was suicidal. It's about whether Nathan Reeves had the right to injure him in the process of imposing his will on someone who'd made a choice about his own body. Mr. Reeves had alternatives. He could have called 911. He could have used verbal de-escalation. He could have contacted bridge security. Instead, he decided to physically grab Mr. Castellano with such force that he dislocated his shoulder and fractured his collarbone. Those injuries were not inevitable. They resulted from excessive force and lack of proper training. Vega had emphasized Owen's ongoing pain, his psychological trauma from the physical restraint, and his right to bodily autonomy even in the midst of mental health crisis. Judge Finch had interrupted Vega multiple times, asking pointed questions that suggested skepticism about his arguments. Counselor, are you seriously suggesting that Mr. Reeves should have let your client jump while waiting for emergency responders? Vega had tried to argue that trained crisis negotiators would have talked Owen down safely, but the judge had looked incredulous. In the seconds available before he jumped, you're asking me to believe that verbal intervention would have been effective when your client had already climbed over the railing and was preparing to let go? Vega had insisted that we couldn't know what would have happened, that perhaps Owen would have changed his mind if given more time. Judge Finch had shaken her head. That's speculation. What we know is that he was about to die, and Mr. Reeves prevented that death. The injuries sustained during rescue don't eliminate Good Samaritan protection. The judge had taken a brief recess to review the briefs and supporting evidence, then returned with her ruling. I've reviewed the materials submitted by both parties, and I find the defendant's argument persuasive. Nathan Reeves acted in good faith to prevent imminent death by suicide. His actions were consistent with what any reasonable person would do when confronted with someone about to jump from a bridge. The injuries sustained by Owen Castellano were regrettable but unavoidable consequences of necessary physical intervention. Good Samaritan immunity applies, and this case is dismissed with prejudice. She'd banged her gavel firmly. Furthermore, I'm sanctioning the plaintiff's attorney for bringing a claim that was objectively without merit and appears to have been motivated by financial considerations rather than legitimate harm. Mr. Bibber, Vega, you'll pay the defendant's reasonable attorney fees. This lawsuit should never have been filed. The courtroom had gone silent. Diane had smiled and squeezed my arm. Vega had looked genuinely shocked. Margaret had put her face in her hands. Owen had simply stared at the table in front of him, showing no reaction at all. As we'd stood to leave, I'd caught Owen's eye for the first time since pulling him from the bridge. He'd looked at me with such profound emptiness that it had stopped me mid-step. Not anger, not gratitude, just vast nothingness, and I'd realized that Owen wasn't actually present in any meaningful sense. He was being moved through this process by other people, his will subordinated to Margaret's financial desperation and Vega's contingency fee ambitions. The man I'd saved hadn't wanted to be saved, and now he was trapped in a life he'd tried to end, being used by people who claimed to protect him. Outside the courthouse, Diane had explained what would happen next. The dismissal with prejudice meant Margaret and Vega couldn't refile or appeal on the same grounds. The sanctions order meant Vega owed us approximately $53,000 in legal fees, which we'd have to pursue through collection efforts since he'd likely fight payment. I was completely vindicated legally, but the damage had already been done. My job situation remained uncertain, my savings were depleted, and my reputation was permanently marked by the public lawsuit regardless of the outcome. Diane had assured me that dismissal with sanctions would send a message to other attorneys considering similar cases, that Owen's lawsuit might actually help protect future Good Samaritans by establishing clear legal precedent. But that distant benefit felt hollow compared to the immediate wreckage of my life. I'd returned to work 3 weeks after the dismissal, but things had changed fundamentally. Dennis had welcomed me back and restored my project management responsibilities, but several longtime clients had requested different managers, uncomfortable with the controversy regardless of the legal outcome. Coworkers were friendly but distant, unsure how to interact with me after months of public scrutiny. I'd been tainted by accusation in a way that dismissal couldn't fully erase, and I felt it in every interaction, every meeting where people avoided mentioning what had happened while clearly thinking about it constantly. The bridge incident had become my defining characteristic at work, overshadowing 8 years of successful project management and reducing me to the guy who got sued for saving someone. Margaret had fought the sanctions order viciously, filing motions claiming she couldn't afford to pay attorney fees, and that the lawsuit had been filed in good faith based on Owen's legitimate injuries. The court had rejected her arguments, finding that she'd knowingly pursued litigation against medical advice and for financial gain rather than Owen's benefit. She'd been ordered to pay the full amount through a payment plan, with consequences for non-compliance. Vega had been censured by the State Bar Association for the frivolous filing, receiving a formal reprimand that would remain on his disciplinary record. His reputation had taken a significant hit in the local legal community, with several articles discussing the case as an example of personal injury abuse. But neither Margaret nor Vega had apologized or acknowledged wrongdoing. They'd simply moved on to other cases and other opportunities to exploit human suffering for profit. Owen had been released from his sister's guardianship 4 months after the dismissal, his psychiatrist having determined he was stable enough to manage his own affairs again. I'd heard through Diane's investigator that he'd moved into a supervised living facility for people with serious mental illness, was receiving intensive therapy and medication management, and was slowly rebuilding some capacity for independent function. He'd never reached out to apologize for the lawsuit or acknowledge that Margaret had used him. I'd wondered occasionally whether Owen even remembered the bridge or understood what had happened in the months following his suicide attempt. His mental illness had been so severe and the medication so heavy that he'd essentially been absent during his own lawsuit, a ghost being manipulated by people who claimed to care for him. 2 years after pulling Owen from the Morrison Bridge, I drove across it for the first time since the lawsuit. I'd been avoiding that route intentionally, taking longer alternate paths to work and appointments, unable to face the place that had transformed from rescue site to source of trauma. But that morning, traffic had forced me onto the bridge, and I'd found myself in the exact lane where I'd stopped that October afternoon. The stretch of railing where Owen had stood was empty now, just metal bars and gray sky and the river far below. I'd pulled onto the shoulder again, this time deliberately, and gotten out to stand at the spot where I'd grabbed him. The wind was cold, carrying the smell of water and exhaust, and I'd tried to remember what I'd felt in that moment before everything went wrong. Certainty, I realized. Pure certainty that I was doing the right thing. Standing there, I'd understood something that had eluded me through months of legal combat and reputation destruction. I would do it again. Even knowing everything that followed, even understanding the cost, I couldn't have driven past and let Owen die. That certainty wasn't about heroism or moral superiority. It was just fundamental inability to witness death and do nothing. Whatever the consequences for me, however Owen's family had weaponized his rescue, he was alive. Damaged, ill, maybe never fully recovering, but alive with possibility rather than dead with finality. Margaret's greed and Vega's opportunism and the legal system's failure to protect rescuers didn't change the core truth. I'd saved a life, and that mattered regardless of who appreciated it or how much it cost me to do it. A car had pulled up behind mine, hazards flashing, and a young woman had gotten out. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She'd been concerned, probably thinking I was in distress, and I'd realized how I must have looked standing at the railing staring down at the water. I told her I was fine, just remembering something that happened here. She'd nodded and gotten back in her car, but before driving away, she'd rolled down her window. "If you're thinking about jumping, don't. Whatever's wrong, it's not worth it. People care about you even if it doesn't feel that way right now." I'd thanked her for checking on me, touched by her willingness to stop and engage with a stranger who might be in crisis. She'd driven off, and I'd stood there thinking about the community of people who chose to help despite risks, who stopped and engaged and tried to make a difference. I'd returned to my car and continued across the bridge, and as I'd reached the far side, I'd seen him. Owen Castellano, standing at a bus stop with a backpack and a coffee, waiting for public transit. He'd looked healthier than the last time I'd seen him in court, more present in his body and his surroundings. Our eyes had met for just a moment as I'd driven past, and something had shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition, but awareness. He'd raised his hand in a small, uncertain wave, and I'd waved back before traffic pulled me forward. I didn't know if he remembered me or understood what had happened between us, but that small gesture had mattered. It suggested he was emerging from the fog of mental illness and trauma, becoming someone who could engage with the world again. 3 months later, I'd received a letter forwarded through Diane's office. The envelope had Owen's name in the return address, written in careful handwriting that suggested effort and intention. Inside was a single page, and the letter was brief. "Mr. Reeves, I'm writing to apologize for the lawsuit my sister filed using my injuries. I was not in my right mind for many months after the bridge, and I allowed Margaret to make decisions I should have made myself. I know now that you saved my life that day, and that you suffered terribly because of it. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you and your family. I'm getting better now, slowly, and part of that recovery is taking responsibility for what happened. Thank you for stopping me from jumping. I'm not glad to be alive every day yet, but some days I am. That's progress. I hope you can forgive me. Owen, Castellano. I'd read the letter multiple times, feeling complicated emotions that resisted simple categorization. Relief that Owen understood what had happened, gratitude for the apology, lingering anger about the damage his lawsuit had caused, profound sadness about the suffering that had driven him to that bridge, and the continued struggle he described. I'd shown the letter to Tessa, and she'd cried reading it, saying this was what I'd needed, this acknowledgement that saving him had mattered. I'd written back, a short response saying I forgave him and was glad he was getting help, that I hoped his recovery continued. I didn't mention the financial cost, or the job impacts, or the ongoing reputation damage. Those burdens were mine, and Owen carried enough without adding guilt for consequences Margaret and Vega had created. Judge Finch's dismissal of Owen's case had established precedent that several subsequent Good Samaritan cases in Oregon cited, creating clearer legal protection for people who intervened in suicide attempts. The state legislature had passed additional protections the following year, explicitly shielding rescuers from liability for injuries sustained during good faith suicide intervention. Those legal changes wouldn't help me retroactively, but they'd protect others who found themselves at bridges, building ledges, or anywhere someone was trying to end their life. Diane had testified before the legislative committee about my case, and several lawmakers had referenced it when explaining why the new protections were necessary. Small comfort for what I'd been through, but meaningful if it prevented others from facing similar retaliation for helping. My family had recovered slowly from the financial and emotional damage of the lawsuit. We'd refinanced our house to cover the legal fees that sanctions didn't recoup, adding years to our mortgage but stabilizing our immediate finances. Tessa had gone back to working full-time to rebuild our savings, and we'd explained to our kids in age-appropriate terms what had happened and why I'd been sued. They'd understood in the simple, clear way children do, that I'd helped someone who needed help, and that sometimes people don't appreciate being helped even when they should. That childlike clarity had helped me process my own feelings, cutting through legal complexity and moral ambiguity to the basic truth that saving lives was right, regardless of consequences. Owen continued his recovery at the supervised living facility, making gradual progress through intensive therapy and carefully managed medication. Diane's investigator had kept loose tabs on him through public records and occasional updates, and the reports were cautiously optimistic. He was attending support groups for people who'd survived suicide attempts, working part-time at a library shelving books, living as stable a life as someone with his psychiatric history could manage. He'd never fully overcome the trauma of his wife's death or his own near death on the bridge, but he'd learned to function despite those wounds. That was all anyone could ask. Margaret had paid her court-ordered sanctions slowly and resentfully, completing the payment plan just before enforcement actions would have escalated. She'd never apologized or acknowledged her role in exploiting Owen's crisis for financial gain. 5 years after pulling Owen from the Morrison Bridge, I attended a community event about suicide prevention and mental health awareness. The organizers had invited me to speak about my experience intervening in a suicide attempt and the aftermath of that intervention. I'd been reluctant initially, not wanting to relive the lawsuit or discuss the legal nightmare publicly. But Tessa had encouraged me, saying my story might help other people understand the importance of protecting Good Samaritans, while also recognizing the complexity of mental health crisis intervention. I'd agreed, and I'd stood in front of 70 people describing that October afternoon when I'd stopped my car and run toward a stranger preparing to jump. I'd talked about the fear and certainty I'd felt, the physical struggle, Owen's injuries, and the devastating lawsuit that followed. The audience had been silent throughout my presentation, and when I'd finished, several people had approached me with their own stories. A man whose brother had jumped from a building before anyone could reach him. A woman who'd talked her friend down from a bridge and now suffered guilt about not having done more sooner. A former police officer who'd pulled 3 different people from the same overpass during his career and understood the complicated aftermath of forcing someone to live against their will. These were people who lived with the weight of suicide, either their own history or someone else's, and they'd recognized in my story their own struggles with intervention, agency, and the impossible choices mental illness creates. I'd realized I wasn't alone in carrying this particular burden, that there was a community of people who understood the cost of helping. Owen had been in the audience. I'd noticed him sitting in the back row during my presentation, his expression focused and sad. When others had approached me afterward, he'd waited until the crowd cleared, then walked up slowly. Thank you for talking about what happened. Most people don't understand how complicated it is, saving someone who doesn't want to be saved. I'm sorry I made it harder. His voice was steadier than in his deposition, more present. I'd told him I was glad he'd come, that seeing him healthy enough to attend community events meant the intervention had been worth it. Owen had nodded. Some days I agree with you. Other days I'm still angry you didn't let me jump, but I'm working on it. My therapist says that ambivalence about living is normal for survivors, and that it can coexist with gratitude. I'm trying to hold both. We'd talked for 20 minutes, carefully navigating the complicated relationship between rescuer and rescued. Owen had explained that he'd cut contact with Margaret after learning the full extent of how she'd manipulated him during his illness, that he'd forgiven himself for the lawsuit because he genuinely hadn't been capable of making sound decisions at that time. He'd asked about my family and whether we'd recovered from the financial damage. I'd told him honestly that it had been difficult, but that we were stable now, that the precedent from his case had helped protect others. Owen had looked relieved, as if that outcome justified some of his suffering. Before leaving, he'd handed me a small card with his contact information. If you ever need to talk about that day, or if you're struggling with what happened after, I'm here. I owe you that much. I owe you everything, really, even if I'm still figuring out how to feel about having everything. I'd kept that card in my wallet, checking occasionally to make sure it was still there. I'd never called Owen, feeling that some distance was healthy for both of us, but knowing I could contact him if needed had mattered. The bridge remained part of my daily commute, and I'd gradually made peace with driving across it, with seeing the railing where Owen had stood, and understanding that I'd done what I had to do. The lawsuit had changed me in ways that would never fully heal. I was more cautious about helping strangers, more aware of legal liability, more cynical about how easily good intentions could be weaponized. But I'd also become more committed to helping others understand the importance of intervention, of acting despite risks, of choosing courage over convenience when someone's life hung in the balance. The woman who'd stopped to check on me that day when I'd stood at the railing had filed a Good Samaritan lawsuit 6 months later, sued by someone she'd helped during a medical emergency. Her case had cited Judge Finch's ruling in my case, and she'd been dismissed quickly with similar protections. She'd reached out through social media to thank me for fighting my case publicly, for establishing precedent that had protected her. These small connections reminded me that fighting back mattered, that refusing to settle had created legal shield for others who'd faced similar retaliation. The cost to my family had been steep, but the protection for future rescuers was real and lasting. 10 years after the bridge, I stood on that same stretch of railing during a memorial service for suicide prevention awareness. Owen stood beside me, both of us older and marked by our shared history. We dropped flowers into the water below, honoring people who'd been lost to suicide and people who'd been saved. Owen's recovery had been long and imperfect, filled with setbacks and struggles, but he'd built a life worth living. He'd remarried, worked as a peer counselor for other suicide survivors, and spoke publicly about mental health. Our relationship remained complicated, colored by trauma and lawsuit and the fundamental asymmetry of rescuer and rescued. But we'd found a way to exist in each other's orbit, united by that October afternoon when I'd grabbed him and refused to let go. Some rescues don't end cleanly, don't resolve into gratitude or closure. They just persist, complicated and difficult and necessary, proving that sometimes saving a life means accepting permanent entanglement with a stranger who becomes something more than stranger, but never quite family. Owen was alive, and that was enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.